Harriet Griggs never made it home from her evening walk. 10 days later, Thomas Kelly's body was found beside the same stretch of abandoned railway. Then Elaine Marsh vanished, her lifeless form discovered under a crumbling rail bridge. Each victim was bound, silenced, and left near the tracks, each murder more precise than the last. But as police raced to stop the so-called railway reaper, they uncovered something far more disturbing: the killer wasn't acting alone. He was following a blueprint written by a dead man. In the early hours of July 3, 1998, the town of Alston stirred to an unease it hadn't known in decades. Nestled in the English countryside, Alston had always been quiet, a place where nothing ever really happened, where life moved at the pace of its morning trains and weekend markets. But that calm shattered when a local jogger stumbled upon something in the tall grass near the old North Alston train station. At first, it looked like discarded clothing. As he stepped closer, he realized it was the body of a young woman lying face down in the dirt. The victim was soon identified as 27-year-old Harriet Griggs, a teaching assistant at a nearby primary school. Known for a warm nature and active involvement in the community, her death shocked everyone. She had no known enemies, no recent relationship drama, and nothing about her life suggested she would be the target of such violence. But the scene told a different story. Her hands had been tied behind her back with a single, grimy shoelace. Her throat had been cut in a straight, precise line, neither rushed nor messy. There were no signs of struggle, no sexual assault, no theft. Whoever had done this had been in complete control. The police began their investigation cautiously, unsure of whether this was a random act of violence or something more targeted. Interviews were conducted, alibis were checked, and CCTV footage from nearby roads and the small station's old camera system was reviewed. Nothing stood out. Harriet had last been seen leaving a friend's house the previous evening. She had opted to walk home, enjoying the summer air. Her route took her along a quiet path by the disused railway line, a shortcut locals used frequently. No one saw her after that. Rumors spread quickly in Alston. Some residents speculated it was a drifter passing through on the train. Others whispered about dark rituals or someone hiding in the woods near the station. But as the days passed, no new evidence surfaced, and the police struggled to make progress. Harriet's funeral was held less than a week later, drawing mourners from across town. Still, no one could explain why someone so kind and harmless would end up a victim of such a deliberate and cold-blooded crime. Behind the scenes, detectives noted one particularly chilling detail. The way Harriet had been killed, specifically, the binding and the precision of the wound, suggested a degree of planning and control. This wasn't a spontaneous attack. It was meticulous. The location, too, was unsettling. The North Alston station had been closed for years, left to rot with peeling signs and rusted tracks. It wasn't a place anyone visited unless they had a reason. At the time, investigators hoped it was an isolated tragedy, a one-off killing that would eventually be solved. But 10 days later, another body was discovered just a few miles down the same line. Bound in the same way. Killed in the same fashion. And with that, the nightmare truly began. The second body was found on July 13th, only 10 days after Harriet Griggs was laid to rest. This time, the victim was Thomas Kelly, a 34-year-old railway maintenance worker known for his quiet nature and punctual habits. He had failed to return home after a night shift near the Linton Junction, just 4 miles down the railway line from where Harriet was found. His body was discovered by a colleague during a routine morning check of the tracks. What he saw brought a wave of dread and grim realization: this wasn't an isolated murder. Thomas was lying flat on his back, just off the gravel beside the tracks, partially hidden behind a row of shrubs. Like Harriet, his hands were tied with a shoelace, old, worn, and stained. His throat had been slit in the same chillingly precise way. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of a robbery, and nothing had been stolen from his person. His wallet, ID, and tools were all untouched. The only thing taken was his life. The town of Alston, still reeling from the first murder, now fell into panic. Two people, completely unrelated, both killed within days, both left near railway tracks, and both bound and murdered in the exact same fashion. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Forensic teams scoured the scene and quickly linked the two murders through the matching shoelace bindings and the near identical blade marks. The level of control and staging suggested a killer who wasn't rushing, someone calm, experienced, and purposeful. The police launched a formal task force, now convinced a serial killer was at work. Dubbed a Rail Watch, the unit included local officers, detectives from surrounding counties, and behavioral analysts from London. Their first priority was to understand the pattern. Why the railway? Why these specific victims? Both Harriet and Thomas had completely different lives, different routines, and no known connection to one another. The only link was their proximity to the railway line and the manner in which they died. Checkpoints were set up along train routes, patrols were increased, and residents were warned to stay clear of the tracks. Still, fear continued to rise. People who once took evening walks by the line now avoided it entirely. Train usage dropped. Parents refused to let their children near the area. The once peaceful town had turned suspicious and frightened. In the midst of mounting anxiety, investigators struggled to find leads. CCTV coverage along the tracks was limited and mostly outdated. DNA evidence from both scenes was inconclusive, and no one had witnessed anything unusual. Profilers suggested the killer might be someone with access to train routes or someone who knew the area intimately, possibly even a former railway employee. The case gained national media attention. News anchors spoke of a railway reaper stalking the lines of Alston. Journalists flooded the town. But with all eyes watching, the killer seemed to vanish. Days passed. Then weeks. The town began to hope it had ended. But just when it seemed safe again, the third murder shattered that illusion. And this time, the killer left something behind. Something that would change the entire investigation. The third victim was Elaine Marsh, a 41-year-old schoolteacher who had taught at Alston Secondary for nearly 15 years. She was known for her punctuality, her soft voice, and her predictable routines. On the evening of August 4th, she left the school building just after 5 p.m., walked to the bus stop, as she always did, and then vanished. When she failed to arrive home, her husband reported her missing that same night. By morning, search parties were already combing the streets. It didn't take long before her body was found beneath a rail bridge 2 miles outside town, carefully placed on the gravel slope just beside the track. Once again, her hands were tied behind her back with a worn shoelace, and her throat had been cut in the same exact fashion, one clean, deliberate slice. There were no signs of a struggle or restraint. Beyond the binding, no bruising, no resistance, no indications of panic. Police noted how eerily neat the scene was, almost staged. Her handbag lay untouched a few feet away. Nothing was taken. Just like before, the killer had only taken a life and left behind a mystery, but this time, there was a difference. Beneath Elaine's body, partially pressed into the dirt, police recovered a small rusted key. It was about 2 inches long with an ornate bow and an industrial shape, not something common like a house key. It had no tag, no engraving, and didn't match any local locks or doors. For days, investigators tried to identify where the key belonged. Locksmiths were consulted. Railway authorities examined it. Still, its purpose remained unknown. With this new clue, the investigation expanded further. Police revisited the earlier crime scenes of Harriet and Thomas. Search teams returned to the areas, digging and sweeping every inch. But nothing new was found. It seemed the key had been intentionally left, not accidentally dropped. It was a message, a signature. The discovery of the key brought fresh energy To the Rail Watch Task Force. Investigators began cross-referencing unsolved cases and missing persons connected to the railway network, stretching back decades. One retired officer remembered an old report about a railway inspector who had gone missing in the mid-1980s, Clive Renner. He had been dismissed after multiple disciplinary issues, including stalking complaints from passengers and erratic behavior. During inspections, after his termination, he had disappeared from public view. Using old property records, police tracked down a ramshackle hut hidden in a patch of woodland close to the tracks, just beyond the bridge where Elaine's body had been found. The location had long been forgotten, overgrown, decaying, and consumed by vines. Inside, they found something they didn't expect. There was no killer waiting. No signs of a recent inhabitant. But in a dusty corner, half buried under stacks of newspaper, was a battered brown suitcase. Inside the suitcase were photographs. Dozens of them. They were black and white, grainy, and taken from a distance. 3 stood out immediately: Harriet, Thomas, and Elaine, each captured in candid moments before their deaths. But there was a 4th photograph, an older man, standing alone beside a railway platform, staring directly at the camera. His name was Clive Renner. And it was now clear this nightmare had roots stretching back further than anyone had imagined. Police wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation into the location linked to Clive Renner. The crumbling shack hidden near the tracks hadn't been touched in years. Layers of dust coated every surface, and ivy had crawled in through broken windows. Inside, detectives found a bizarre collection of railway memorabilia: old maps, conductor hats, rusted tools, faded train tickets, and stacks of official timetables from past decades. But what stood out the most was the wall. It had been transformed into a disturbing collage of photographs, sketches, and train schedules. Red yarn connected various points across the maps, forming a web that seemed to track movement across the rail network. Among the clutter was Renner's journal. Faded and brittle, its pages were filled with dense writing, thoughts scribbled in chaotic bursts. It wasn't the rambling of someone planning random acts of violence. It was detailed, methodical, and disturbingly focused. He wrote about protecting the railway from decay and described passengers who disrespected the line. To Renner, the tracks were sacred. Anyone who disrupted the order through littering, noise, or mere indifference was an offense to his code. In his mind, the railway needed cleansing. The more investigators read, the more disturbed they became. Renner's journal included chilling language that closely mirrored the killer's behavior. He described techniques for silent kills, methods for tying restraints, and diagrams that eerily matched the locations where the bodies had been found. It was as though someone had followed his instructions step by step, but Clive Renner was supposed to be long gone. He'd disappeared without a trace more than a decade earlier. Until now, he'd been just a forgotten name in an old personnel file. Investigators intensified the search for him, combing through death records, utility bills, and sightings. After weeks of digging, they found the answer in the most unexpected place: an abandoned train carriage tucked inside a fenced-off scrapyard miles away from the original crime scenes. Inside the rusted carriage, workers discovered a foul odor and reported it to the authorities. When the police forced open the sealed compartment, they found human remains. Dental records confirmed what investigators feared: it was Clive Renner. He had been dead for at least 2 years. Cause of death appeared to be suicide. He had left behind no note, no warning, just silence. His remains were hidden in a train he had likely admired for years. The killer they had spent months chasing could not have committed the recent murders. Renner had died before the first victim was even found. The revelation changed everything. The murders weren't just the work of a disturbed man, they were a legacy continued by someone else. Someone who had read Renner's journal, studied his twisted beliefs, and decided to finish what he started. The killer had picked up the thread where Renner left off, using his writings as a guidebook for death. Now the task force faced a terrifying truth: the real murderer was still out there. And he was copying every move with chilling precision. The investigation turned inward as shock settled over the Railwatch task force. They had spent months chasing a dead man. The real killer had been using Clive Renner's journal as a blueprint, replicating his thoughts and rituals with terrifying accuracy. But now, knowing Renner wasn't responsible, they had to start again, this time focusing not on the past, but on someone who admired it. Someone obsessed enough to turn a dead man's madness into a living nightmare. Detectives began reviewing footage, questioning railway workers, and looking into anyone who had access to the old station, the storage sheds, or any of the abandoned train yards. That's when a new name surfaced: Gavin Morley, a 29-year-old volunteer at the Alston Rail Heritage Museum. He had a fascination with train history and was known for spending long hours cataloguing artifacts, restoring old photographs, and studying blueprints of the defunct rail network. Museum staff described him as quiet, intelligent, and always eager to help. No one ever suspected he could be dangerous. When detectives visited Gavin's home, a small rented flat on the edge of town, what they found chilled them. Inside, his walls were lined with framed newspaper clippings about the murders. Printouts of online articles were pinned up in careful order. There were sketches of crime scenes, time schedules of train departures, and even mock case files labeled by victim name. It wasn't just research. It was obsession. Buried under a pile of train manuals, police found the key clue, literally. A small wooden box containing a collection of rusted keys. One of them matched the ornate key left beneath Elaine Marsh's body. It had been planted there intentionally, a symbol, a breadcrumb. Gavin had admitted the key had no real meaning. It was a prop, a way to mislead investigators into believing the crimes were older than they were. It was a part of the performance. When confronted with the evidence, Gavin didn't deny his involvement. In fact, his confession came calmly. He spoke with a disturbing level of clarity, explaining that he had found Renner's shack years ago, while exploring disused railway paths. The journal had been there, left behind like treasure. At first, he said, it was just fascinating to read. But the more he studied it, the more he felt connected to it, drawn in by Renner's twisted ideology. Gavin believed he was preserving railway history, bringing Renner's vision to life. He meticulously recreated the murders exactly as Renner had written, choosing victims at random but near tracks, using shoelaces from old uniforms, cutting with a blade he had sharpened according to instructions in the journal. Each murder was, in his words, historically accurate. His goal was to complete what Renner never could. Gavin Morley was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The case closed with a mixture of relief and horror. Though the murders had ended, the shadow they cast remained. Alston's railway reopened, its silence broken once more by passing trains. But the town would never forget the darkness that travelled its tracks, the crimes not born from hatred or chaos, but from an obsession with the past that spiraled into death.